San Diego teachers with histories of inappropriate sexual behavior with students aren't always fired. Even when they are, the records are often kept confidential. California's aid in dying law is on hold after 2 years. What that means for terminally ill patients who want control over how and when they die. And how do you help PTSD patients who don't think they deserve it? The VA looks at how to treat veterans suffering from debilitating guilt over actions they took on the battlefield. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, investigative reporter Ashley McGlone of Voice of San Diego, freelance journalist Kelly Davis, and KPBS military reporter Steve Walsh. Well, often they are award-winning coach, most popular teacher in the school, the teacher of the year, the educator that colleagues and parents least suspect of sexual misconduct with students. Criminal charges against teachers who have sex with students make headlines. But what about complaints of inappropriate touching, comments, even stalking? Ashley, why do unsubstantiated reports of teacher misconduct so often remain secret?
So school districts often get to withhold records about employees, citing the personnel records exemption in state law as well as privacy protections. But the courts have said substantiated cases of employee misconduct, the public's right to that information outweighs the employee's right to privacy. Okay,
your latest investigation, you've done a lot of work on this, and a long series of stories. What was into Chula Vista's High School 27 Chula Vista's High School Teacher of the Year. 3 students came forward with complaints. Well, what did they say?
So last year, 3 female students came forward and reported that they'd been targeted for months physically and verbally with harassment. They said that he would grab their hips and rub his hands over their thighs. 2 of them said they went on a shopping trip and he made one of them try on a revealing dress while he took photos of her. A school trip to Disneyland early last year also was problematic. One girl said he tried to lure her to her hotel room by herself, but she was sort of able to stall and get out of that situation. Another said she was accosted on a school bus and grabbed from behind. The police did investigate that and refer their findings to the DA, but no charges were filed.
Okay, so that's a case, and as I mentioned at the outset, they make headlines when there's an affair or sexual misconduct directly with students and teachers, but this is a little more of a gray area. Is that teacher still teaching?
So he was removed from Chula Vista's classroom from Chula Vista High School last spring. He's been on paid leave all of this year, and he will resign voluntarily this June 30th under the terms of a departure deal that was negotiated last fall.
And what was the result of the investigation there by Sweetwater officials?
So in a July 2017 report, their investigator found that there was severe and pervasive harassment with these girls. They found their accounts credible. Again, rather than outright terminate, they negotiated this deal. He has been teaching, though, for the last several months at Lakeside Middle School and after-school classes for Christian Youth Theater.
And the folks there are unaware of what's going on?
Yeah, they said they inquired with Sweetwater, and Sweetwater didn't disclose any issues or concerns despite this report that found
But that was their agreement, right?
Correct, yeah, that was a part of the settlement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now is that unusual? Does this happen in these types of situations?
Not entirely. A lot of the time school districts will want to avoid the costly and lengthy process to terminate a tenured teacher, so they enter into these deals which often have confidentiality provisions.
How costly can that get?
Oh, it could span for months or years, up into the $100,000. If they lose, $200,000, $300,000 range. So often they do the deal. Yeah.
And what legally are schools required to do to prevent future students from being abused at some other place?
So even though some of those deals do have confidentiality provisions, a change in a teacher's employment status while misconduct allegations are pending, they do have to report that to the Teacher Credentialing Commission at the state level. They're also mandated reporters, so they're supposed to report to local law enforcement suspected child abuse. As far as prevention, some school districts do anti-harassment training, although I hear the quality of those trainings can vary greatly from school to school.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Kelly?
Something that really surprised me is when you talked to the police department, they said they'd never gotten a copy of the school district's investigation.
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
You'd think that they would cooperate and hand over any relevant information.
You would think after the fact. I know the girls came forward in February of last year. The police investigated February and March, turned it over to the DA. Again, the DA declined to prosecute. The school district report wasn't finished until July, so they took several more months. Again, why they didn't take that step to share it with police, I'm not sure. Chula Vista Police did say they're looking at it to make sure there wasn't anything they missed or if there's other witnesses. I'm not sure if anything's going to come of that.
I mean, would that be something, because the DA said, they declined to prosecute. I mean, could that be something that causes the DA to reopen their...
Yeah, time will tell. I've talked to some of the parents. They said they have not heard again from the DA's office. But again, Chula Vista PD was very interested because it is a 63-page report, quite a bit of detail in there. Again, enough to convince the investigator that there was a problem and this employee needed to stay away from Chula Vista schools, but not enough to actually outright terminate.
Now, you spent many months gathering information for your series on sexual misconduct in the schools. What are you asking school districts for, and what's the impetus of this report?
So last November, we sent a public records request to every school district in San Diego County, and there's more than 40, seeking substantiated sexual misbehavior and misconduct records involving employees or officials arising in the last 10 years. What we're not seeking are student names or anything, student related in that matter. Sometimes I get in touch with those people or they reach out to me, but that's not something that's being provided by the school districts. Some of those districts have sort of quickly turned over records and others have delayed or postponed or fought our requests and said they're not going to disclose employee names who've been disciplined. So we've been dealing with that. And some teachers actually have gone to court to try to fight to keep their records secret. Vista and San Marcos, the judge ruled in favor of disclosure against the teachers, so we're now looking at those documents.
All right, Steve?
I don't know, one of the things that struck me is, in this day and age, it seems to me that the rule should be a little bit brighter here. Why are teachers still touching students at all, unless there's an emergency or they're physically, trying to restrain someone? Why are they touching students at all? And
what I'm seeing is sometimes there's policies on the books that say, you are not to have physical contact with the student in the case, unless there's an emergency. But school to school, principal to principal, they might kind of allow, okay, you can hug your students or you can even communicate on text or social media. And then you do have individuals who take advantage of those to foster inappropriate relationships.
Shopping trips, things like that. It seems like that's not something you really should have a teacher
right. And this teacher said, he did make a habit of driving students home, taking them on shopping trips. His claim was that the dresses didn't come in time for the show, and he wanted to make sure these outfits fit them for the show. And but apparently that wasn't the first shopping trip. This was a pattern.
Yeah, he was named
Really?
2017 Teacher of the Year. At what point did that happen?
It was right. He was named Teacher of the Year right before these girls came forward, and they said they had tolerated behavior, but the Disneyland incidents made them really troubled and said that they didn't want other students to have to face what they've dealt with, and that's why they came forward.
Now, in gathering all this information from the various school districts, is your sense that sexual misconduct remains a problem? It goes, as Steve was saying, in this day and age, everyone seems to be aware of this and what's going on in the past few years.
Yeah, I think what's most interesting is seeing how schools deal with it. So sometimes you see an employee, again, like I said, if there are criminal charges filed, then maybe that makes the news and maybe they resign or they're fired outright or they lose their teaching credential. Times where it's maybe less clear-cut or the statute of limitations has expired. Sometimes you see teachers that have been reprimanded over and over and over again, maybe a slap on the wrist. They aren't actually suspended or terminated, or maybe there's a short suspension. Some school districts are moving them from school to school, taking a teacher who they found was harassing students at a high school, pushing them at a middle school, I guess, is their solution there.
I guess the bottom line question is, how much does the parents and the public get to know that these accusations have been substantiated in some level?
The answer is a lot. The problem is school districts and the employees might not know that, and so you might have to go to court to fight to enforce the public's right to know. What the public does not get to see are unsubstantiated or non-credible claims or allegations against a teacher. So if the school district said, okay, these allegations came in, we couldn't prove them, the public doesn't get to see that. But if they found them credible, the public does have a right, but you might have to go to court.
Okay, and knowing what your rights are. Fascinating stuff, and I assume you'll be following up and doing more stories on this topic.
Yes.
All right, we're going to move on. As many as 200 terminally ill Californians choosing to end their lives and suffering find themselves in legal limbo. The state's aid in dying law, enacted 2 years ago, was overturned in May. And Kelly, start with the law, which you've had personal experience with. What did it provide for, and what does it do for people suffering with terminal illness?
It allows anyone diagnosed with a terminal illness who has 6 months or less to live. They go to their primary care doctor, and the primary care doctor verifies, yes, you have a terminal illness, yes, you will die within 6 months. There has to be a second doctor who confirms all that, kind of a psychological evaluation, lots of paperwork, and once it's clear that this is that person's choice, they're not being coerced, they want to end their life on their own terms, they get a prescription for Adenine medication, which then they can take.
And the person has to be of sound mind. We're not talking about elderly dementia patients.
They have to be, yes. It has to be very clear that they're not being coerced, that family isn't pushing them to do this because they're a burden or because they want the life insurance policy. There are so many. We went through this with my sister, and the amount of paperwork and oversight and protections in place gave us the confidence that this is a good law.
All right, now this California law was overturned, and we should say other states have this law as well, but not most by any means. This California law was overturned by a Riverside judge in May. What was that specific ruling?
So just a little history. The day the law took effect in early June of 2016, this group called the Life Legal Defense Foundation filed a lawsuit making a bunch of arguments against the End of Life Option Act. And one of them was that it wasn't passed, it had been passed during a special healthcare focused session of the legislature. So the plaintiffs argued, well, this has to do with assisted suicide. It doesn't have to do with healthcare. So that was one of their many arguments, and the judge, Riverside Superior Court judge, agreed in May that, yeah, you're right, this had to do with decriminalizing assisted suicide. And so in his ruling, he overturned the law. And
there's another hearing coming up, though, in a couple of weeks now. We're looking ahead to that. The Attorney General's going to
they
invited to counter
it was
argument.
Kicked over to, they did an emergency appeal. Unfortunately, the appellate court, for now, the appellate court agreed with the Riverside judge, and the law is currently still overturned. But there's going to be a hearing on June 29th.
So as we say, then patients who are in this situation would have been able to choose when and how to end their lives under this law are just in limbo.
Completely in limbo. Like I said, I'm a journalist on one hand, but on this issue I'm an advocate because it involved a family member, and I keep in touch with the folks at Compassion and Choices who helped get the law passed and are now kind of helping with appeals, and they've shared with me stories of people who, this terrible illnesses, they were going to die. This gave them some comfort, and now they either can't get the prescription or they have the prescription and they don't know what to do. Will something go wrong and their death will be considered a suicide and not the one woman, that's her fear, that it will be on her death certificate as a suicide, where under the End of Life Option Act, it would have said that she died from cancer.
Okay, now let's talk about your sister, Betsy. She was one of the first people in California to take advantage of this.
I think the second one officially, maybe, or yeah.
Okay, and tell us about her illness and how she chose to take advantage of this law.
Yeah, she had ALS. She had been suffering from ALS for 3 years. She had lost pretty much all movement. She was able to kind of move one pinky that she used to communicate with her friends on her iPad. She was losing the ability to speak, and she was such an outgoing person, loved to communicate with folks.
She was
loved
an
to
artist,
meet new
right?
people. She was an artist. She's just a all-around great chick. So she was becoming trapped in her body, and that's not what she wanted. And there were no clinical trials, there's no treatment, there's no hope, there's nothing. She was getting to the point where she's going to need a feeding tube and she was going to need a ventilator. And she didn't want artificial means of staying alive. And so she went through the process of obtaining the medication, and through a great weekend-long party for her family and friends that was amazing. We laughed, we had a great time. It was all on her own terms. It was her rebirth party, as she called it, and it worked. This allowed her to have some control over her life, die on her own terms. It was exactly what the authors of this law envisioned.
She planned it. She did it the way she wanted to.
Yeah.
And tell us about your family's experience. I know it's a terribly difficult time with this illness and this diagnosis, but going through the process and as your sister planned this event.
It's hard to admit that there's no hope, but seeing how much relief I was with her the day the law took effect, and you could see the relief, you could see it. It was just tangible, visible. It was pretty powerful, and this spared us from having to watch her suffer. And like I said, the process of obtaining the medication was time consuming. It was a little burdensome, but we were okay with that because it proved to us that this was a solid law.
And it worked as intended.
It worked as intended.
In your case. Now, opponents of the law say it lacks proper safeguards against people being coerced to take their lives. What's your response?
Being a reporter, I want to be armed with all the information that I can get. I have been scouring the internet, news, everything, looking for a case where this law failed somebody. And there was even a special website set up by opponents of the law where they said, we're going to be collecting stories of the show this law can be abused. And so I went to that website yesterday, and the page, name of the group, /stories, I got a 404, there's
nothing there.
There's nothing there. I scoured the rest of their website.
But do we know of any stories where people change their minds, especially since we've had this stay in the law?
Yeah, plenty of people, they'll have the medication and then they could decide, do they want to stick around a little longer? Sometimes it's just comforting knowing you have the choice.
We do have a bite from a patient. Our former health reporter at KPBS, Kenny Goldberg, talked to an ALS patient before she took advantage of this law, and it's Eureka Strato. Let's hear her take on that.
I think it's just humane. We help our animals out when they suffer. Why don't we allow the same for ourselves? And I know that they're worried about abuse, but the way that this is written is like you have to say it. Personally, you have to say that this is what you want, that you totally understand it.
All right, that sounds like it was your experience with your family and your sister.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, well, it's a fascinating story. We'll see what happens on June 29th and what the ruling does and whether it's reinstated or not.
There's an expectation that this will continue on to the California Supreme Court, that it won't end at the appeals court level.
All right, we'll certainly be following up with that. Thank you. Well, we're going to move on. The Veterans Health Administration has expanded efforts to deal with high rates of suicide among veterans. One area of focus, veterans experiencing feelings of guilt and shame to the point where they conclude they don't deserve to live. And Steve, this seems particularly tough because of post-traumatic stress disorder. And what's the VA doing to try and address this?
So I did a story earlier this week where I looked at a study that the VA in San Diego, a nationwide study that they're doing here, looking at the role that guilt and shame play in the treatment of PTSD. And I actually ended up talking to a vet who had an experience when he was in Iraq.
Yeah, and we're gonna set that up. There's an exchange here, part of your interview here, which I think is very telling. Let's hear that.
At this point, he's running out of ammunition. That's when a car is barreling toward their position, and he was faced with a choice.
Opened fire on the vehicle, took out the engine block first, then the wheels. And then proceeded to lay waste to the inside of the cab.
Later, he found out who was inside.
An old man, a young woman, and 2 children in the back seat.
Tell Seinecke he was under fire. Tell him he didn't know who was in that car.
You can hear that from anyone else, but like I'm hearing that from you, but it's like death. It doesn't process the same.
All right, and that veteran wound up attempting to take his own life.
Yeah, that was Jesus Seinecke, who this happened outside of Mosul in 2004.
This was at the end of an 11-hour firefight. His unit leader had been hit early on in the fight. This car comes barreling towards them. He asked for permission to fire. He's got what's called a SAW. It's a 50 caliber machine gun. To understand that, this could cut a car in half. This is a very powerful weapon. Makes the decision. And and as he said, he finds out later who is inside of that car. As what many people do when they are in this situation, they tuck that memory away, they avoid it, they don't pay a lot of attention. It's 2010. He is out. He's been out of the military for years at this point. He has an altercation on a traffic stop. He said he just made a boneheaded move. It took a couple of people to subdue him. He had a young son. The state threatened to take away his child. And he just lost it. And
that drove him to the brink.
Attempted suicide at that point. And that's when he finally really got the treatment. And that was the spark that he needed. Not so much that he was taking his own life, because in many ways he was suffering from this guilt and shame. The thought of losing his son, that's what drove him into treatment.
So how did he get a handle on that and get through this?
There are a whole bunch of different ways of dealing with PTSD. The one he said that really worked for him is he had a mentor who had his own experience with combat, who kind of helped him work through this. A lot of what you deal with PTSD is avoidance. You have to be able to focus in on this and then design strategies for coping with it.
And then he becomes in a good position to help other people based on his experience.
He does. In fact, he's doing some counseling with the VA, he tells me, and he's working with other vets in this situation. He was able to actually get his son back and now has a young daughter, too.
Okay, so the VA now, as we said at the outset, the researchers are trying to expand a lot of the reasons, the treatments, and delve into this whole idea of guilt and shame in PTSD patients. Do they know how big a factor that is?
Well, they know it can be a major factor. The biggest problem here is when you're talking with somebody, how do you treat somebody who doesn't think they should get better? These memories become a cornerstone of people's personalities. They believe they deserve this. You know, you can, like he was saying, you can tell him that you didn't know who was in that car and you were under fire, and it takes a long time for somebody to hear that. So if you're a physician and you're trying to treat this person, how do you even get them into treatment? That becomes one of the big questions. And for the VA, as part of this national study, they're looking at, once they get them in there, which treatments work best for them, because there are a variety of them out there.
Now, is this fairly recent to look at the suicide rates? And tell us about the rates. They're certainly higher than the general population.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot about suicide among the general population. This is something the military and Department of Veterans Affairs have been looking at very deeply now for a long time. There was a time in the military when they had a lower suicide rate than the general population, but along came a couple of wars, and the suicide rates began to climb, not necessarily tied to people who had been in combat, which tells you just how elusive this problem is and how hard it is to really get to the bottom of it.
And it differs, the rates differ from male veterans to female veterans, right?
It does. It's higher among, there are certain risk groups. One of them are veterans who have just recently gotten out of the military. That first year is a tough year for a lot of people. Women have a higher suicide rate than men. We're not exactly sure why that is. Some of it may be that we don't understand how women process this kind of trauma. PTSD is still a very new diagnosis, and most of the study has been on men, so we just simply don't know what might work best for women. Women may also be much more comfortable with firearms once you've been in the military, and so they have greater access to methods.
And the VA is having to deal with reluctant veterans who just don't take advantage, don't even sign up for the VA. What do they do about that?
So we've heard that figure before. 20 veterans a day take their life, somewhere in the country here. And the VA has known for a couple of years that about 6 of those 20 are in actual VA care. The rest of them are not. So how do you get to those folks? So they've come up with a couple of different programs. One of them was just signed by the president, where if you're coming out of the active duty, they automatically enroll you in mental health care. So you're in until you opt yourself out. So then you don't have to worry about signing up. And there was a program that was now officially 1 year old where they're trying to get at some of the folks that don't qualify for VA care at all, people who might have a dishonorable discharge or less than honorable discharge. The plan was to give them 90 days of treatment. Show up in the ER. We don't care about that right now. Just we'll get you into treatment, and then we'll maybe work on your paperwork problems during that 90 days. Sounds like a pretty good idea. We have seen very little from the VA as to whether or not, how many people even took advantage of that.
And as you say, it's so new, they're still trying to study it. If the automatic enrollment, that's pretty new too.
No, that's incredibly new. That just started up. And here's another one of the problems. We've heard about all of the turmoil at the VA. David Shulkin was the head of the VA. He was a holdover from the Obama administration. He had really targeted suicide as really one of the areas he wanted to concentrate on. So these programs really came up under his tenure. We've now seen a couple of different VA
So is it going to continue here?
So we don't know whether it's not. In fact, the acting director of the VA was supposed to be in San Diego next week, and now I was just told this morning they've canceled that trip. So it's very hard to get information out of the VA right now.
All right, we're out of time, but we will certainly follow up with your stories and excellent reporting on that. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Ashley McGlone of Voice of San Diego, freelance journalist Kelly Davis, and Steve Walsh of KPBS News. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today.